Good evening, everyone listening to us via Kyrie, DBS, and on Facebook and YouTube. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this post-budget debate. Today, as you listeners and viewers are aware, Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerrit presented the 2018-2019 budget, a total budget in the amount of just under $1 billion, $987 million. In what has become a tradition, we host, through the Office of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet Secretariat, this post-budget discussion. My name is Edward Lambert, and with me in the studios of GIS tonight to conduct this discussion are, to my far right, Mr. Kenny Green, who is the recently elected president of the DAIC and owner-manager of Apex Services, Dr. Lennox Honeychurch, who I think doesn't need any introduction to any Dominican, and to my immediate right, Mr. McCarthy Murray, an economist and hotelier. Mark and Lennox have been with us over this last, if I can recall, 5 post-budget discussions. And gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Today, we heard a spirited presentation from the Prime Minister Skerrit that waxed high and low, that moved emotions, that generated all types of emotions, under the theme, from survival to sustainability and success, a resilient Dominica. Gentlemen, what were your first impressions? Your first overall impression of the budget statement?
Firstly, thank you for having me here. Talking as an individual, taking away my role as president of the DIC, the budget is full of good intentions. That's the first thing. And whilst that is inherent in nearly every budget, obviously there's a social contract that the government has with the people in order to be able to ease their pain at times of pain. And this is an extremely apt moment for a budget that can ease pain, because there's a lot of pain across the land since Maria. So I got this sense that there's a lot of expectation from the general public, and that the budget was attempting to meet those expectations. And I felt that that was the attempt that was being made. And so from an individual point of view, I see it as a handout in terms of reaching out to the general public and as much sectors as possible. As the president of the DAIC, I see it reaching out to the aims of the private sector to try to repair itself, to rebuild, and also to be able to monetize itself back to health. And I saw that with certain explicit attempts through waivers and policies that looked forward to business coming back to business as usual. And on top of that, I saw some attempts to justify, and I have to use that word carefully, because resilience has been touted a lot as part of the theme of this government since Maria. And I was very interested to see especially the banning of non-biodegradable materials, because that is one of the first tangible steps I've seen made by any government to actually take their words and turn it into tangible actions. And that was commendable. So that's my first impressions.
Okay. Lennox, could you?
Yes.
First overall impression.
Yeah, my first overall impression was I had a kind of deja vu in that I was remembering the 1980 budget address of Eugenia Charles, the first Dominica Freedom Party budget, which came 11 months after Hurricane David. And many of the same issues were reflected in this because there were many of the same challenges. It was 11 months after Hurricane David. There was the question, for instance, of roads, ports, bridges, buildings, and homes. And of course, the rehabilitation of agriculture. In those days, of course, the focus was bananas and coconuts. Now we have a much broader and much more varied aspect to agriculture, which was elucidated in the address. But one of the things in comparison to 1980 is we had less. There were less things. Yes, we had roads. Yes, we had just opened the Deepwater Harbor and it was damaged and it had to be repaired, etc. But the thing is that there is now far more to reconstruct. And people's expectations about this reconstruction and revival are far deeper, far more demanding than they were then. In 1980, the people in the East had no electricity. So there was no electric system to have to repair. Now you have this challenge of getting the utilities over to the East. And as the Prime Minister himself mentioned, those areas, for instance, in the South and Southeast, are a challenge that we have to face. Then, of course, there was no internet. That was another challenge. People have got accustomed to internet. We want our internet towers back. We want our systems. But it does show that the more you have to lose, and the more you have to replace. So now we find ourselves in a situation where the infrastructure is far more developed. The 1980 budget came at the beginning of the Freedom Party era. They still had 15 years to run. This has come over 15 years after the government got into power, and also the fact that they are having to repair things that they had already put into place. We ourselves had discussed very idealistically some of the previous budgets. Last year, of course, we were dealing with, as he himself said at the beginning of the budget, you know, in July last year, there was no idea of the force that we were going to face with Hurricane Maria. And all of a sudden, we had to deal with this, and once again, we had to rebuild. But I think that essentially the budget, by focusing on this resilience, is making the point that anything we do has to be far more permanent than any repairs that have been done before. I go back to the Freedom Party again with resilience. A lot of schools were lost, and during the Freedom Party era, under Eugenia Charles, the schools that had in fact survived in Maria, the concrete domed schools like Massac and any of those at Penville, for instance, and the other schools that were constructed with these concrete domes, they were resilient, and they were constructed in the 1980s, and they proved their point. So whatever we're going to do, we are going to have to ensure that it can withstand, and some of these cases proved it. The road program that has been mentioned and that is being embarked on is vital, because we have to connect the communities. And we remember in the 1980s, those of us who were old enough, those big road projects, Sintra, Nello Altair, and all the others that connected all the roads together. So this is the challenge that we face, and that the Prime Minister has elucidated very clearly. In fact, it was a little repetitive because he gave a general outline in the first half, and then he went into more detail on the specific things in the second half. But we can discuss those. As we go along. The whole question of the difficulty of accessing funds, for instance. But just to end, if we analyze the title, from survival, that is the mere business of surviving, to sustainability, to ensure that we can sustain ourselves in various ways, and the hope, of course, is success. We still have the hurricane season to go through, and it's very unpredictable, but what we are trying to build is a resilient Dominica that will be able to face any such challenges in the future, better equipped to fortify ourselves against such natural disasters.
Mark, what's your take now?
Essentially, the budget took the line I expected it to take, given the fact that we were just coming off from 2017 with the largest ever hurricane to hit Dominica, at least in my memory. I survived Hurricane David and I survived this one as well. So I was expecting the budget to be the way it is. In other words, to focus on rebuilding and rebuilding better, which is a theme that, of course, is might say a hangover from America. That we rebuild, but we don't rebuild the same way so that it gets damaged, so we rebuild better. I was particularly interested in the question of housing and the fact that the Prime Minister, not necessarily in the budget speech, but on a previous occasion, made mention of apartment buildings. But it seemed to me that our natural way of living has been to live horizontally, you see, which means we occupy a fairly large area of land, most of which is land that really should not be occupied by dwelling houses. And we're going to have to move into, which we've started a bit already, into multi-family buildings, let's say apartment buildings, so that in suitable places where it's decided that people can live relatively safely, they will have to put the people there to live, and they'll have to be living one above the other in apartment buildings. That's already on the way, and I think I'm actually quite pleased with that. But there is, back to the housing situation, and Lennox made some mention of it there about the electricity and the utilities. The fact that the Dominica population is so sparse, and there's only really a bit of a density around the Roseau conurbation, poses severe challenges for the utilities in particularly the east coast of Dominica, as well as the high cost per person of building roads. Because if you drive to the airport anytime, after you've passed the roads, you're probably going to meet only 2 vehicles coming the other way and maybe one behind you. But the road has to be built and maintained, and it's not very used by a lot of vehicles. So the question I think we have to consider carefully is whether in the future, or starting now even, we shouldn't be considering gathering the people in what you might call a more sustainable area, in the sense that we develop clusters where the population is relatively dense, so that the cost of delivering services, especially utilities, to each person goes down, which would seem to be somewhere on the West Coast generally. And then people could go off to farm on their farms outside of where they live, which is what, for example, people in St. Joseph do already. They hardly do any farming right in the St. Joseph area, but they all travel up to the Lyle Valley and so on. That's where their farms are, and they come back in the afternoon because the roads are there, can facilitate the traffic. So yeah, generally the budget was good there, although there are some things I thought that in the context of resilience that might have been missed. Because I think recently people might have heard on the radio that Dominica in 2016 had the highest rate of prostate cancer deaths in the world, which means that this is a serious problem if we don't address it. The question of the...
Who generated that statistic?
It's from an American journal of oncology. Yeah, in point of fact, I checked it with the statistics department. If it was 59.1 per 100,000, Dominica has about 70,000 people. That would mean 42 persons died from prostate cancer. Yeah, it works out. It works out. I knew the figures, but I didn't know the ranking, which is, not very good news for us.
When we talk about the distribution of population and the servicing of that population, yes, it is a major challenge. And another challenge that we are facing and will continue to face, I've had discussions since Maria a lot of different funding agencies and representatives.
Okay, we're going to come to,
Yeah?
we're going to come to those issues. But
Okay.
Let us for a moment zero in on the theme and look at the dynamics, reflect on the dynamics in the address itself, from survival. I think the first 3 or so pages in the budget address speaks of how we survived, right? And it makes the point that Dominicans are already a resilient people. We are already a resilient people. And in the early days, the critical matter issue was relief. And people were able to survive because of the fiscal prudence of government, that there were financial resources available to order food because the infrastructure, the production system, the infrastructure for housing was destroyed, right? So there's a heavy focus on survive, and it keeps saying, you recall, we survived. And we didn't survive by chance, right? There was an outpouring of support from a number of agencies coming in. But the point I want to get to, Lennox, you went back to 1980, and when Ms. Charles presented her budget. But how do you think that her presentation of the budget then compares with the presentation of the budget that we heard today in terms of a vision for the Dominican people? It was just another budget, if I recall correctly.
Well, it was a post-hurricane budget.
It was a post-hurricane budget.
What I'm basically saying is that the requirements at that time to repair and to rebuild and to make sure that they were rebuilt better, as in the case of schools and the case of bridges and all this sort of stuff, the elements were the same. You see, the thing is with the budget, the language was very beautiful, and I'm sure that you had some influence on this. But the fact of the matter is, when you look below the language, behind the language, you realize that there are essential groundwork that is the same, that you have to provide access for farmers because you're relating it to agriculture. You have to connect communities. You have to repair utilities and all that. So you can dress it up as much as you want, but down below there are these urgent needs that we are having to deal with, regardless of the ideals that we have around them. So essentially, basically, the resilience in the rebuilding better was something that you see, the thing with Dominica that irritates me a little bit is that sometimes we negate, because another party was there and wasn't, we negate what the other party did and we think we're starting afresh. The whole concept of Dominica post-independence has been, for better or for worse, an administration does whatever they do, and then it's built on by another administration. And therefore, the country as a whole benefits from the combined efforts of one administration after another. So I don't think that we should really negate what previous administrations do. No. But at the same time, I do agree that in this budget, the focus has been on ensuring that we do things which are sustainable. I mean, Mr. Green has just mentioned a while ago, it's a simple thing. It may sound simple, but the fact that a commitment was made to use biodegradable material instead of things like plastic and styrofoam and so. That's a first step. Many of our neighbors have done it in Martinique and Guadeloupe. It's already well established. It's difficult to institute, but it's also what comes out of this budget, an constant education process. Because while you're developing, while you are restoring, while you're being resilient, you have to be educating people about resilience and about sustainability. Okay. So in effect, that was part of this budget, educating the population about their role in facing this challenge.
Okay, Kenny, we faced with a situation where, as a result of the destruction, essentially we faced with a bill of $3.51 billion to rebuild and repair, right? Based on Kenny Green's observations and soundings on the ground, do you are you of the view that, you know, the average Dominican is fully aware of the magnitude of the task ahead of us?
No. It's quite simple. They're not. And the expectations for one are much higher. And let us start with one point. The private sector does not necessarily have that illusion, but maybe the public sector and the general public does, and I'll tell you why. There was no productive sector operating after Maria, yet public servants continue to get paid. So that sense of total disaster, whilst it was there, it was still relatively eased by the fact that people got paychecks and they continued to have a semblance. I'm not saying they had normality. The private sector, on the other hand, we had to lay off people. You know what happened after the hurricane. We had to lay off people. We had to gird our loins, so to speak, and recognize that things were just going to be horrible. But just that sense that you could actually have a salary after the biggest disaster in our history, but also one of the biggest disasters in the history of the Caribbean, created almost a sense that this was doable. We could do this. And it may have given a false sense of security at the time. When I say false, I mean from the perspective that it put the disaster, it made the disaster a little softer. But that was a good thing in terms of the government being able to sustain the public sector and therefore be able to sustain some level of activity. Because everything else had collapsed. People were not able to, businesses were not able to run, the inland revenue could not collect VAT or revenues, tax revenues, but that ability remained. In terms of people on the ground, I think by nature of getting through this, people are resilient. Let's face it, there's a strong sense of being able to make it out. I still do think that there are lots of psychologically scarred people in Dominica right now. I think the extent of which we still have not really explored. But in terms of being able to weather that storm for the first 3 to 6 months, you know, the amount of people who walked around, had to walk from A to B, had to give up the creature comforts, had to do without, as you say, electricity and internet, things that we took for granted, was incredible. People had to step to the plate and recognize they had to do things different to get back to where they were before. But I still think there is a sense that government and someone else can do this for us, because we've not yet explored and understood that even how things are done. I mean, for example, the expectation of Dominic, when Dominic themselves, I mean, even the Prime Minister was very strident with Dominic, I think previously in a previous speech he gave, but Dominic are stretched. I mean, they had to bring in resources from off island like everyone else. So the general public still has not got a sense of what that GDP loss means, because this government has typically softened the direct effect on the general public. The private sector has less illusions, I believe, because we're having to do this. We have to do it. We know what it's like to have to do it all on your own, especially the entrepreneurs in the economy. And I think this budget recognized, I started to see recognition from the government that the private sector needs to be treated like the general public.
Mark, what is your take? Do you hear grumblings on the ground, for example, that things are not happening, people complaining, still not realizing, you know, the tasks ahead of us?
I would say people are grumbling the way they usually grumble. But I think there was a big difference. I think Lennox and I were both in Hurricane David. And I think that there's a difference in the attitude of the people in both times, in the sense that, well, there's no electricity, so everybody says, well, yeah, we'll wait until electricity comes, which might be 18 months. In my case, it took 18 months before I got electricity. Whereas with this event, But the week after the event, everybody wants his electricity back. And they're grumbling about where is the electricity, Domlec, and we need my phone to work, and so on. You know, there was this, might say, impatience. I don't know if we are the impatient generation.
Well, it's what I mentioned before, that the expectations now are higher than they were then. People were more accepting of the situation, whereas now we're more demanding.
Yeah.
In resilience, one of the things that we must remember too is that whereas sometimes if we were totally dependent, let's say on agriculture, banana industry, where every fortnight we were getting money, we wouldn't have that backing of the CBI funds, and this created a great difference in that, as you mentioned, Kenny, about the payment of civil servants and whatever, the fact that there was the 4.7 million or whatever that's there, to be able to provide ready income to continue to pay people, and that civil service money then filtered into the community from those civil servants into people who were not civil servants, and that the government had the ability to be able to finance certain projects quickly, small-scale projects in various communities, would not have been possible if we didn't have that backup of CBI funds available to complement the money that was then slowly coming in from international aid donors.
Okay, so we have this scenario where there is utter devastation of the country, its infrastructure, all its means of production, distribution, and exchange. People are in despair, and the Prime Minister in his address says that in this scenario, he had to craft a vision for the country, a vision of hope. And that led, as you know, to his address at the famous address at the United Nations, where he said that he wants to make Dominica the first climate resilient nation in the world. Right?
Can I just interrupt a minute to say, I don't know if it was his own idea or he was advised to do it.
Wait a while,
but
no.
a brilliant stroke
well, I'm coming.
diplomacy to have gone to the UN at the time he did. Yes.
Okay, so the question before us, gentlemen, this vision, do you think this is a vision that most Dominicans have caught on to? Have bought into?
Let us understand that speech touched, you could almost say, the world.
Yeah.
Because the response from the international media, and these are people like New York Times, the Telegraph, the Times in London, the Guardian, everybody carried it. That here was this little country that was espousing this grand idea and actually blaming the big nations for actually contributing to something which had devastated this community. I think that was a real stroke of brilliance, whoever devised it, and it did make an impact internationally. I think what happens is, and it happens over and over again with various leaders, sometimes we're so accustomed to our own home leader that we don't take it with the same impact that somebody else overseas would do. But every funding agency, every foreign diplomat who has contacted me, discussed things with me, that speech comes up. And I think that this is important in impressing funding agencies to go that extra mile. Because let us not forget that you have your 15 hours of fame or 15 minutes of fame, and once a few months are passed, your disaster is forgotten while they deal with other disasters elsewhere. So you have to be able to make some kind of impact that will touch the souls of the funding agency. I mean, even the Prime Minister today, he said it is increasingly difficult to access funds. There's the trade wars going on, there's the rising oil prices. There is, so therefore we have these challenges out there where people's attention are focused elsewhere, and we have a long-term challenge and a long-term task ahead of us, which we have got to accomplish, while at the same time keeping our presence in the mindset of those foreign donors.
So well said, Lennox. Mark, you think we have bought into it? The vision?
Yes, I think, well, how should I put it? Yes, I think even without the Prime Minister having said it out. I think that's essentially what the public has in its mind or in its heart. You know, the Prime Minister articulated it, but I think I wouldn't so much say that they followed his lead in this as much as that's the national desire. And he happens to expose it, yeah. So I don't think he has to I don't think that he has to go out and convince anybody that's it.
Showman.
I actually think there's a natural cynicism and a natural, we have one of the most paranoid populations
Exactly.
in the world.
Very true.
In fact, we almost have a conspiracy theory population. So I don't necessarily think that at the time it was issued, I think like everyone else here, I concur that it was a brilliant move. It actually got to the people that it needed to get to the most, the outside aid agencies, but our people were naturally doubtful and skeptical about all of this, whether it's for political lines or others.
Because they were still traumatized?
No. That is the natural nature of people. However, I will say this, that if you take, it's like the budget, there's an intent, and then if you turn the intent into action, then people slowly come along. So for example, one agency that I am familiar with, because we were partly responsible for bringing them here, Israel Aid. The fact that Israel Aid are in communities in the East, actually putting on roofs, for those people who would say, you know, why is he saying this? What is he saying? What does that mean? For them now, seeing someone like Israel who would never have had contact with Dominica if it wasn't for the awareness that came from that speech and the reach outs that came from then, it then means something to them. But for those other people whose roofs are still off or who have had issues with getting relief, they will remain cynical until the action matches the intent. And so that's how things happen.
What I meant was the people, without the government saying anything, the event has happened and they would like to get back better than they were before. Because the people whose roofs went, they obviously want to say, well, if I'm going to have another roof, I would like my roof to stay on for the next hurricane. So there is, I think it's naturally within us.
But Eddie, sorry to interrupt you, but Eddie started with a different premise from Survivor. The first thing that I heard on the ground was Dominica finish. That's where we started from Dominica finish to who was trying to get out of the country. And to look at, people weren't thinking about, I'm going to build back better. That wasn't even in their heads. They were thinking, how the hell do I get out of here? So to be where we are right now, yeah, we've gotten a lot better.
This is what he has raised there, what Kenny has raised there, is another concern for the long-term carrying out of these ideals. Let us not forget that a lot of people left. A lot of people are going to stay out. I had discussions with the World Health Organization chief statistician. She was saying that by the next census in 2020-21, the population from her analysis would be down into the 47,000 bracket. Now, out of, even if that is an exaggeration, out of that core, you have got to find the manpower to achieve the wonderful things that the Prime Minister has said. And when he mentions all of these various national plans and these national organizations, CREED and all these people, the Climate Resilience Agency and all that, where are these people going to come from to sit on these things and to administer these things? Even to the point of people who are capable with skills. We have a great problem with skills. We know the contractors are trying to scrape around, and anybody who can wield a hammer is being hired onto their jobs. Contractors, I have met them, gone around in their projects. They have 7 projects dealing with that, different roofs, different houses, and they're trying to spread their workforce across those. If you take that to a larger amount and you stretch it over the next 5, 6, 10 years, you have got to have that manpower and that skilled manpower to be able to carry out these things.
But Lennox, the skilled manpower doesn't have to be Dominican.
That's what I'm going to
It
say.
doesn't have to be
That
all
was
Dominican.
That is what I'm going to
Right.
say, because the Prime Minister today said
Yes,
it,
yes.
that we are going to have to rely, just as in the case of Dominic, I mean, that's a phenomenon, to have Barbados Light and Power, people from as far as the Bahamas, Lucilec, and all these other companies from the region coming and assisting.
Incidentally, I see no conflict.
There's no conflict.
I noticed
No,
But
that-
I'm just saying
That's
that
right,
that
yeah.
will be a necessity that we have
Well,
to
yeah, yeah.
incorporate in our development thoughts and
It
projects.
fits into the national paranoia because, as we know, our cost of doing business is also elevated by things like, for example, the shortage of agricultural labor and the fact that people simply will not work for even unskilled labor. But to get onto a particular theme, the paranoia I spoke earlier about, hopefully, and I'm hopeful that the engagement with outside resources who are now looking at working in Dominica and living in Dominica for an extended period of time. There's quite a number of St. Lucians here, for example, and who have committed themselves to being here for the next year to 2 years. And as these people start to live amongst us, become part of the framework, because we are living in an OECS which is supposed to have free movement, and there are many Dominicans in Antigua, there are many Dominicans across the OECS living and building their lives like they should. But we need to be able to match that and start dealing with a future where it does not necessarily mean that it has to be a Dominican to have a family here and to work here and to live here. And I think that national paranoia can be eased by that, because there's always this sense that someone is going to come and take Dominica away from Dominicans, and I never understood it.
I'm actually fully in agreement with Kenny on the business of the fact that we need to have an immigration program, a definite active immigration program, not a passive one. In other words, we set up systems and we go out and say, tell to people, Dominica is a good place to live. You can come here and make a good living for yourself and for your family, etc., etc. Because as Lennox rightly pointed out, hurricane or no hurricane, the expectation was that the population of Dominica is going to decline and get old. Yeah, it's already set in train. That's what's going to happen. And the only way we can counter the bad effects of the decline in population is, in point of fact, to have a robust immigration program. Immigration to get people to come into Dominica to join us so that we can expand the economy, for sure.
But you see, this other challenge that has been brought to me by certain funding agencies, let's just choose health and education. One of the health advisors coming in, and we have got to be dealing with this issue, saying, okay, your population is going to be 48, 47,000. You cannot therefore have 49 health clinics. How politically, as I told them, does the government reduce the number of health clinics to fit in with the population? Or the schools already, before Maria, the Ministry of Education was having a challenge with primary schools, where in certain small communities, the primary school population was like 14 or 12. You close the Cochrane School and tell everybody go to Massac, and you continue this process. Now, the statisticians from these international funding agencies, IMF and all these people, may well tell the government, look, you've got to tighten up on all of this largesse.
Well, they have done so in the past.
And they have done so in the past, but politically and socially, it's a very difficult decision if you take it at all.
Before I just in there, Ken is in ICT.
Yeah.
And I think the question of the delivery of health services in our districts and so on there, having a proper use of ICT can take care of a lot of those diseconomies that the statisticians are talking about are saying. Same thing happens for schools and education. I could stay here and teach a class of 30 people, each of whom is in a different village immediately. I mean, and it's doable right now. It's simply the will to do it. In other words, we have to adopt the modern techniques and technologies that are available.
Well, UE Open Campus is doing it across the region.
Yeah. So if you want to keep teaching only that the teacher is physically there with the student, then that's problem, as you mentioned there, remains. But if the problem is there, then we must find innovative solutions.
Okay, that is
to
what
get
building
around it.
resilience is all about. Let's kind of shift gear and speak of, in the budget address, it outlines, what being climate resilient means for us in Dominica. We have a unique topography, we've had unique experiences, and it speaks of, building resilient communities. There's a concept of a resilient community, right? And in the budget address, as a matter of fact, the Prime Minister cites the construction of the new city, I should say, or town going up in Bellevue shall pay for the residents of Petit Savan. With all these features of what could be seen as a climate resilient community, the buildings that were completed there withstood the winds of Maria. The utility lines were undergrounded. The water supply was unaffected, and so on. And he makes the point that that is the kind of community that we want to replicate all over the country, and we will at some point in time declare ourselves a climate resilient nation. What do you think of this kind of approach to building climate resilience? Right?
Well,
in terms of physical infrastructure, there are other elements of it. Right?
well, yeah, for sure, that's pretty useful because if the electricity supply is underground and the hurricane happens above ground, basically, it's protected from the hurricane. But there's something I think that's missing in the discussion or education of the public about climate change, is that climate change actually poses an existential threat to humanity. In other words, that's why people are agitated about climate change, not because there are going to be a few more storms and people might be impacted negatively by the storms. It's because, quite frankly, the human race might go extinct.
No.
That's a
The science available to us doesn't lead us to that conclusion yet. It cannot lead us to that conclusion yet. What the science says is that...
It leads to that.
I said yet.
No. Well, the time frame within which it will happen is a matter of debate. But the consequence of the warming of the climate is that it will, if it continues, it will get to the point where the human race will be unable to live on the planet. And this has happened already. There's some actually got cold, so cold that there were only a few people hanged on, and then they restarted the population of the Earth. But so the change in the climate, which is different from the change in the weather, which is, that's
I will accede
question.
that in the bigger picture, those are concerns. But in the question of
immediate
Dominica and dealing with it, I mean, take for instance, 2 years ago, the head of the geography department of UE campus St. Augustine said in a presentation, UE presentation, that any government building that is built from now on must be 150 feet above sea level. All of these things, I mean, I know because Cabritz is 150 feet above sea level, and I know Cabritz will not, Fort Shirley will not be damaged. I know, for instance, from my experience, we buried everything at Fort Shirley, all the utilities, and we were up and ready to go as soon as Domlec and Flo were ready to move. It was an example of what the Prime Minister is saying, that you have a community, if you want to choose Fort Shirley as a community, where for aesthetic reasons we made sure everything was buried, but for climate resilient reasons, it worked. So it shows, the proof in point.
It can be done.
But the point was made that, he issued a list of these things that would have to be done in communities. It is extremely expensive. The utility companies, once again, because of the distance they have to travel, and the challenges they have in connecting communities. Maybe they will not be able to do it as effectively as that. But I'm more concerned really with the nitty-gritty, down-to-earth questions of what we do in the next 10 years to be able to make us resilient.
That's right, yes, yes.
I have a concern. It's a very, very good question you raised about Bellevue-Chopin and the paradigm of Bellevue-Chopin, because it's a paradigm, because the Prime Minister announced that there'll be more of those done. What I have not yet got a sense of is the design approach that has been taken, where that came from, and whether there is a consensus. Again, you've asked in the past, what does the Dominican public think? Now, earlier on, you made the point, or someone made the point, that in the past, the individual dwelling approach was actually possibly not the most efficient way to use land in the context of Dominica not being a Barbados or Antigua and being flat. However, what you always need to have a sense of is there going to be continuity in that approach? If today the government changed, would that paradigm be accepted? As you've said, someone mentioned earlier, that I think it was you, Lennox, that governments tend to build, even if they say they won't or they don't, they tend to build on what came before. I always have this concern that there is never a sense of consensus on anything in Dominica, even amongst competing thought bases on policy. I have not heard yet that there is an acceptance that is the way forward, because if it is resilient, as it appears to be, then it seems that this is going to change the landscape of Dominica forever, because community buildings will change. Now, how does that affect our communities? Because there's also another part to this. There is the climate resilient building, but there's also the actual communities of people and how they interact with each other, now being in a community infrastructure that is now communal. You know, I mean, people talk about possibly the ghettoization of communities through apartments, but Dominica is different from, say, the United States. We don't have the environment that will allow for a ghetto, not in those rural scenarios. So I haven't seen, and I think maybe what needs to happen, it may be backward forward, or whatever way you want to put it, is to put the design and the planning out there to show people why the government went that way. Because if not only is it now going to have to be accountable going forward, because it's not just a reaction to Petit-Savan being pretty much displaced, it's now a template. It's now been adopted as a template going forward, and we need to justify it to our population so that people feel comfortable with it. That's my thought.
I agree, because I am a little concerned about apartments. In fact, Bloomberg, this online business journal that comes out of Washington, D.C., actually sent a reporter down here, interviewed people, and one woman who is going to be transferred to the new Bellevue-Chopin Petit-Savan thing, she says, I cannot even plant a flower. Right? Well, she'll have to plant flowers in pots. You're really changing the whole pattern of the cultural, social life of people if you're going to put them in 4-story apartments. And there are a whole set of design relations related to this. And then today we hear about many of the communities that are going to be dealt with through the CBI by the Montreal Management Company. Are these the only buildings that the Montreal Management Company can build? And have we signed ourselves off to them that in Georgetown, Portsmouth, La Plaine, Daly, Grand Fond, Casabrousse, Cotton Hill, Maho, Massac, Saint-Sauveur, etc., all of this is the pattern that is going to exist? You know, there are issues really that need to be questioned about this. I don't know how deeply physical planning has been involved. And here comes another thing about resilience. You know, you cannot sort of dictate. It's far quicker to be able to dictate and say quite clearly, this is what it's going to be. It takes a little more time to relate it to the community and relate it to physical planning needs. But I think that we have to be a little careful about how we impose these new ideas upon communities, because it is a completely new departure. It's one thing to have apartments at Bath Estate for people who are urbanized and working in the urban community. It's another thing to have apartments for people who are in rural areas such as Good Hope and Saint-Sauveur and all that area. It looks good.
But are you aware, Lennox, that even the people from who were relocated to Center in Grand Bay, who had properties in Petit Savan,
Right.
during the day they went to Petit Savan and came back to Center. You know, they still continue their agriculture in most cases.
I know Petit.
So that model can continue whether it's the housing is to make an apartment or not.
There are people in Galba, Petit Savan, who
yeah.
are determined to continue to live there regardless.
Yeah,
And there's a
yeah,
tragic
yeah.
story of the guy who had a perfectly good house in Petit Savan, and he was told, oh, you can't stay there, you must go to Lubia. He went to Lubia and he was killed. And his house at Petit Savan at Galba stood up fine. So, you know, this dismissal of whole communities, must be carefully dealt with on a case-by-case basis. What I'm concerned about,
you
just
see
one
the
thing, is the ideal, which is great, but linking the ideal to the reality of our societies.
Well, the reality of the society is that there are 20,000 homes, this properties destroyed.
Yes?
And every single occupant of those 20,000 properties wants to be back in a property tomorrow. Right? Or yesterday.
But it's what kind of property?
Well, this is the urgency to get, you know, the housing and settlements, you know, situation under control, to give people hope. Right? Well, the thing is that Montreal Management is the company that showed the capacity to be able to deliver. Okay. That is important in a situation like that. Within 18 months, you have a complex delivered to you.
I think the equation in the end is going to be if those units are resilient. And I mean, if, for example, the next couple of disasters that we have, these structures hold up as they should, then the complaints about the changes to our societal normalities will ease because people will be safer. But if they don't withstand, then the justifiable retort will be, why did we disturb our natural ecosystem to do this?
We have to, in terms of changing things, we have to take this fact in mind, which is that the climate has changed and it will continue to change in a particular direction. And therefore, if you're going to survive, you're going to have to adapt to these conditions. And as we've seen, for example, there's a little disconnect with the, you might say, the advice that's been given after the hurricane, concentrating on fix your roof, use 5-inch screws, and et cetera, to fix your roof better. But most of the deaths that occurred from water, flooding. So in the entire way in which we have to deal with future disasters. Don't forget, Erica was not a hurricane. It managed to kill 14 people and 16 are missing, presumed dead. So and that happened in 2 years. We are going from the Erica to Maria. So we should expect these events to be more frequent. The problem with what Lennox just explained there is that the fact that Erica caused this big damage in Petit Savan and Maria comes and causes practically, from what we know, no damage, is one of those things that we simply have to say, we don't really know if this area here is going to be impacted every time or not. But we can say for sure that this area fits the criteria of an area that is dangerous to live in. For example, there is no river in Point Michel. But 17 people were lost, they basically all to the river because they're under the hill and there are these essentially ravines, dry ravines. That's where water always comes and gets in there. And if you're going to have, essentially, we know what we're going to have. is more water falling out of the sky every time there is rain.
So it raises,
watershed,
so issues,
Right.
it raises the issue of land settlement and so on,
Right.
and land
Then-
use,
yeah,
you know,
yeah.
all those issues, which is all factors built into the standards, you know. That is why, considerations such as this are responsible for relocating, right, Kulibistri, right, the 18 acres of land in the Makushwi area, is to remove people from waterways. That's a policy now, right? I mean, Dominica, well, the historian will tell us how Dominica was settled in the early days. People just built along the rivers and so on. And the policy now is to remove people from these waterways and threatening situations. Yes. Yes.
Creating, mitigating scenarios for housing is a good thing. It's a lot. I think we have to.
And then the question of
Yeah.
multi-family dwellings comes into play because since there isn't that large amount of land on which you can build, you know, horizontally, then this relatively small acreage that's available to build requires you to build vertically.
Yes, yeah.
You know,
You've been saying that for some time, Mark. Yeah.
Yeah,
Isn't
yeah,
that the first
yeah.
time you've
I
been
was
saying that?
thinking
Yes,
the resilience, the important resilience sector of the energy,
Yes.
or energy supply.
Yes.
So that was another important
That was
component.
highlighted, building
The
resilience. in the
geothermal,
energy
the
sector.
solar-powered microgrids,
Right.
all of these things were outlined in the budget address and are very, very important developments which should be focused on. And I hope, for instance, somebody in Marigot just the other day stopped me and said, you know, you must make mention of the fact that every clinic, because every clinic should have solar power, it should have its own satellite phone, and it should have water tanks.
Water tanks.
I'm talking about not just stored water, so that, because this was one of the problems, that when people went to clinics didn't have, or they were damaged or whatever. There were some of these a focus on itemizing these things, but clinics in key areas, we talked about shelters today on the budget, the fact that the shelters must really be more resilient, and that the buildings that will be built as shelters, even if they serve as community centers and resource centers.
And the point was made to that in the long run, the intention is to have the homes so designed that your home becomes your shelter. So there will be less need to build a community shelter in terms of the numbers to be built and the sizes, etc., because your home will be the shelter. As a matter of fact,
There's one thing in the budget.
yes.
In the budget that I hoped would have been there. And that is radio communication. We have moved to FM only radio communication, and we know the limitations of FM broadcast. And I would hope that the government, they didn't put it in for this budget, but that they would work speedily to re-erect the AM transmitter and to connect it to a subsidiary studio, and that sends the signal to the transmitter underground when they're setting up their underground connections. So I think
No, indeed, because this was a really...
because this hurricane was weird. After the hurricane, I came out in the morning. I put on my radio, which they said you should have a radio with your battery and so on, and there's nothing.
And also what
For
happened,
36 hours.
talking as somebody in the north, there was when the radio did get on, it was the information that the state was giving to its people was not reaching all the people. It was reaching the Roseau area, and because of the FM system.
Okay, gentlemen, you're
That
going to have an opportunity. We cannot,
Yeah.
you know, in this discussion, we cannot touch in detail as to how things are to be implemented. I don't think we have the time for that. There is on the table, right, a climate resilient national strategy. The intention is that the strategy will be the framework document to prepare a national plan, which the various ministries now will use to prepare their climate resilient plan for their ministry. And some of the things you mentioned, I already know that like the health clinics, all those features are already in some of the intended clinics, upgrading of the clinics and so on. But for the limited time that we have, could we shift gear and look at the budget itself for a little while, and then time permitted, we'll look at the proposed interventions for improving the business climate in Dominica. Okay. We have the budget really.
But is there time?
15 minutes left. Okay, 15 minutes left.
We're talking about physical rehabilitation tool, or we've left that subject in terms of the big Roseau project, the roads, and of course the airport, which is a program in itself.
You see, there's so much in this budget
Can
address.
I talk to the private sector and what I see is happening, what has been put on
Will you propose? Okay. Take the lead on that. Take the lead on that.
So let me just talk to the things that the budget offered to the private sector. First, there was the extension of the waiver on import duties on the same list of items for which the waiver was given right after the hurricane. And applicably, it said it will apply to registered businesses in the productive and distributive sectors who are tax and social security compliant, and will commence on 1st September 2018 for a period of 1 year. Yeah. That was pretty clever, I believe, because it gave a gap for compliance. Yeah. If it didn't exist, if it doesn't exist. But as part of the private sector, I think we have to be very careful that a year later, the general public has to see also that there is no gouging.
That's correct, yes.
Because it's incumbent upon us, because people have now understood what is going on. They've bought stuff from overseas. They've been able to price match and look at it. And the government hasn't suggested in here, which is good, a measure of price control. Mm-hmm. It suggests that the government trusts the private sector to do the right thing, right, to use those concessions to be able to energize themselves but not take advantage of the consumer. Right, so we have a responsibility to do that. The other thing that I personally have agitated for is for the financial instruments that are available to have a reality check. And the reality check is that the private sector has debt, is carrying debt, mm-hmm, and needs to be able to access financing, but at the same time have the ability for organizations like the DIC to put a hand up and say, we've got, for example, 30 contractors in Dominica who want to extend their capacity to be able to meet all of the demand for construction, but they can't get financing because the terms are too onerous. How do we ease it to rapidly allow them to get excavators, backhoes, whatever, so that they can actually participate in the economy? And that is hopefully going to be eased by the creation of the joint public private sector finance committee. That's right, yes. So that's good. And I will come to the other thing which is coming from this after I mention this last one, which is the ASICUDA, which is the automated custom and clearance entry system for Dominica. Well, it's unified across the region. But in there has been a automated prepayment module which has not been activated. It's been there since 2011. And there's been representation made for some of the larger members in particular, but across the board, to have this module in place so that we can ease the cost of doing business, because as we know, time is money. Yeah. And so the implementation and the activation of this is a good thing. But what I was going to come to next, I won't talk about the marijuana, that could take a whole evening. What I'm going to come to quickly is, again, the budget and all of these items represent an intent to generate a level of activity and to improve the economy. We tend to go budget to budget without looking in between, and I think there's a need at some point, a 6-month gap, for us to sit back and assess how the government has performed, how they've acted on the things that they said they're going to do, and what kind of activity, especially from the DAIC and the private sector point of view, is being generated. If you have 130 construction jobs and projects across the island and contractors are still complaining on the ground in Dominica, then it's not working as it should. So we need to be able to bring that to the table before getting to that end point where the complaint and the representation starts again. So the intent is great, but we need to see the execution match the intent.
Yes.
Tourism, of course, we talked a little bit about agriculture.
Agriculture.
But a good chunk of the aspects of the budget were related to rehabilitating tourism, the importance of tourism related to nature, all of these things. I feel that we should recognize that fact, that this was made. And the whole question of an important component, the cruise village, the building of a new port because what a lot of things that Maria taught us are lessons which in the budget we are actually trying to correct and put in place. The whole question with the containers, overflow of containers, and hopefully Cane Field as a site will relieve that. So that was a very important policy statement for the future. We of course also had the international airport question, which, as I say, would be a program in itself, but let us understand that from a resilient point of view, our airport at Melville Hall in that valley is susceptible to flooding, as we well know, and also the fact that the approach from the time it was built has always been a bit of a challenge. And so the fact, even if you set aside the whole business of international, we did need a relocation for quite some time.
Now, the capital city, is where a place where everybody over the country, has to gather at some point in time comes to, and you would have heard in the budget that we're proceeding with plans to make Roseau, modernization, a modern city and a climate resilient city, right? What are your thoughts on that? And it was cited, the West Bridge, right, was cited as an example of the type of infrastructure or approach to all the bridges in Roseau, right, to eliminate the threat of flooding of the city, in addition to building the necessary retaining walls along the banks of the river. Your thoughts on this?
Well, my first thought is that special attention must be paid to the, what they call the road link bridge, which is some people refer to as the stadium bridge.
Yes.
Because I think it needs to be rebuilt.
Yeah,
it is too low,
it is
and I think actually, given the state of the climate, back to that again, that it should be removed as quickly as possible, because it's, I would say, a clear and present danger. That should be that. And I want to make a comment about the statement that the Prime Minister made about we should make decisions driven on data, etc. And I think, although I haven't seen it in the budget itself there, that provisions must be made to boost up the statistics department. But that's the job of the statistics department, is to gather and collect information for the entire nation that can have facts on which to make decisions. And I would wish that the government, because it's the Ministry of Finance they fall under, could undertake to boost up the staff. And secondly, the government has a website on which ministries have their information.
Yes, that's right.
The statistics department information that's on there is 2005. There's nothing after 2005. So it's and we supposed to be also be promoting e-government, etc. All of which is supposed to bolster resilience in the economy. So we have to pay special attention to the business of collecting data and making it available to the government decision makers and to the people in the private sector.
And what you have said can apply to what he said, what the minister said about the registry as well.
Yeah, that's right, that's right,
But
yes.
overall, there is another part of this resilient message, is that the private sector in general and the public sector in particular has to modernize its data management to uniformly be able to be accessible off the cloud after a major disaster, keeping keeping data, replicated data outside of Dominica is going to be critical in a secure manner, of course. And in matching that, the private sector has to then be able to meet that same standard, because machines themselves will fail, whether they do so because of climate change or spikes in electricity or any other incidents. But the data is what is most important, right, and yeah, we've lost data previously. We actually haven't quantified, and I noticed the absence of that. That's not the role of a budget, but we haven't quantified how much data was lost, because when we say, we talk about GDP lost, I don't think that data is included in that. And data has a quantifiable valuation that is critical as well.
Just one point in relation to Roseau, which was made in the budget, and I think is crucial to the movement of traffic and people around Roseau. That back road from the UE Center down into Cateville, it was mentioned in the budget, and I think it is a key relief to the pressure of Roseau, and I hope that it will be given top priority.
It will be. Okay, Mark, your favorite area now. Let us spend a few minutes looking at the budget itself, right? The situation with respect to let's look on the revenue side, right? The estimates for 2018-19 indicate an expected estimated tax revenue of $359.9 million, right? Which is down from estimated 2017-18 of 365.4, right? Yeah. Clearly indicating that lots of people are still jobless and probably not paying taxes. That's personal income taxes, revenue.
Because right, the government has given so many concessions on the revenue stream that we usually collect. For example,
the waivers, yeah.
Because normally in 2018 there should be lots of money collected because of the amount of construction activity that's going on, and the materials that have to be bought to facilitate that. Yeah. But if the government has waived these taxes, then it doesn't collect these taxes that it would normally collect. So I think that's the main reason is the waiver of especially the VAT on the building materials and related goods that the government has given.
And of course,
because I would say
the 1st of September.
Right, another waiver coming up. I would say, in point of fact, without actually having checked figures or anything, that the level of unemployment in Dominica should be close to zero.
That's correct.
Right
yes,
now,
yes,
you know, because although we would expect it to rise again after the construction boom, if you want to put it this way, has abated, you know. Yeah, and well, the income tax threshold, of course, is now at $30,000.
Yes.
So people who make less than $30,000 pay no income tax. They might also not pay any VAT on the building material.
Well, actually, the projection on personal income tax is up over 2017-18. 2017-18, it was 34 million, and it's projected to be 36.8 for 18-19.
Yeah.
That's right.
So because they expect some business.
To just come in on the unemployment, there is no doubt that the private sector outside of the construction sectors have lowered their employment. Because after Maria, what happened was, after the incidents of looting and just general the malaise from the hurricane, people readjusted downwards. An employer discovered that he could do something that he used to do with 10 people, with 4 people. They became more efficient. And because they became more efficient, 6 months later, they've realized that efficiency could result in better throughput for their business. Then there's another segment of people, the people that I'm trying to help represent, who have not opened or are opening below capacity, even though they want to increase capacity because they do not have access to funds. I know of one particular gentleman who has come repeatedly to me looking for access to finance, because the government has done what it needs to do. It's put money at Aid Bank, it's put money at NBD, but then the conditions that exist within the economy to allow people to qualify for those funds mean that it mitigates against what the government wants to happen, which is those funds being turned into active economic activity.
That's just what I'm saying, the question about data to make decisions. It's that the people in the financial institutions somehow don't seem to understand what actually is happening in Dominica. So when a business person comes there and says, I would like a loan for this amount, and this is the situation with the business and so on, the banker, and you this,
I don't have much
and,
time.
and
We
you're
don't have much time, Mark, but I don't think it's a case of they don't not knowing. They're following a template that is given to them. Their employees, their compliance, they are following the mandate of the bank.
No, what I meant, the institution.
The institution itself.
Rather than the individual person.
Unfortunately,
doesn't have a proper understanding of what the economy is and how it functions. For example, everybody who is a hotelier of some sort knows that September is the worst month in the year. I go to some banks and they tell me, well, September, that's booming. They tell me school is open, therefore business is booming. In tourism
You have to build resilience in your finances.
You have to build resilience.
Yes, that's right. At the end of the day, when you have local,
public-private
yes,
partnership is
it's
what
going to
we're
hopefully
to
deal
be
with. Yes,
about, because
yes,
we
yes.
have to let access. It's no use having. Everywhere has liquidity right now.
Even if you have the private-public sector partnership, unless we're dealing, both of us, with the same data information, we're going to be saying contrary things all that, because I have my truth and you have your truth. That's why we need to have data that is the truth.
So in short, I mean, that is why the public-private partnership has to be so close so that the left hand knows what the right hand is doing and what the needs of private sector is.
And that's what that committee.
And that is what that committee is all about.
And it has to act. That's the key. It has to act. You know, it has to mirror the frustration of the private sector business who wants to buy 4 excavators because their contract's passing by, and he cannot access, you know, $500,000 because he has a non-performing loan in another institution, which disqualifies him from starting to get that financing.
Okay,
These are realities.
Okay, we have just about 3 minutes left. Just to mention that the non-tax revenue, largely the CBI, gentlemen, it's projected to bring in 428.8 million in the current fiscal year, as opposed to 421 million estimated for 17-18. So to a very large extent, you know, some of the key projects that we have identified, like the housing, the Roseau enhancement project, etc. Some of the financing envisaged will be coming from the CBI. And yes, and I want to recall that the statement of the Prime Minister that as of today, there are signed contracts for building 3,780 odd homes in Dominica, right? That is 3,780 families, you know, signed contracts actually on the ground at the moment, right? So this is taking a sizable bite in terms of into. In addition to what have already been done to this date since the hurricane, right?
Can I see that we're approaching banana economy levels of dependency on the CBI? And as someone in the industry, the Prime Minister has recognized that. I've heard him say it before. This is why it's important to take revenues and invest it and put it into sustainable, productive forms, because it will decline and it may one day even go away.
Yeah, we are aware that is why, you know, all the hotels, you know, the Kempinski, right? Kempinski,
Correct.
But
also
all these
building
hotels.
capacity in the private sector, building capacity, even in using, as they're doing right now, in using the windfall to actually build an airport or other accesses, infrastructure that is going to be there long after, producing
right.
revenue long after. So that's important, but we have to be concerned that 54% of the revenue is being generated through one.
Okay, gentlemen, you know, we always have the experience in this post-budget discussion that, look, we just touched the tip of the iceberg. There's so many issues that in the budget address we did not have the time to touch on. So we just want to use the last 2 minutes for closing remarks, and we will start in the opposite way we commence. So Mark, you will
Yeah, well, just to say that
closing
the
remarks.
budget was pretty much in the direction expected it to go, mostly dealing with reconstruction and making Dominica a more resilient country. And I'd just like to say a slightly odd thing here, which is that in terms of ITC and social media, etc., that it's not a newspaper. Facebook reported, or somebody reported on Facebook that I was dead. Dead people, of which I am one. So the use of social media in disasters, yes, it's useful, but it's also potentially dangerous. And mischievous people get on there. So we should all, pay attention to how we use social media, whether during disasters, after, or when there is no disaster around,
Well, yes, and given the challenge, I would like to say that under the circumstances, the Prime Minister has really guided us through a very difficult time. He had the experience of Maria as well as Erica, and yet we survive. And the focus on a term that he used, rebuild and reset our societies and economy. The economy and the society as a whole has to meet the challenge ahead. So I think that this was encompassed very well in the budget. We couldn't go into all the detail. Hopefully we can investigate some of the main points that were raised at some other forum. But given the situation, I think we have the outline, the plan for what we have got to do in the years ahead.
Kelly?
The template has been set. I am eager to see the execution, because it's the execution that is going to turn everything that has been promised into something that is going to be resilient. Without the execution, we have a plan. And the plan on its own looks good. I have to say this, and anyone who looks at the budget and says it doesn't look good is probably telling a tale. But I think, as I said before, that we have to probably spend some time, have a midterm, a kind of state of the nation, in between the budget speeches, to give an update on where we are. Because the private sector, the general public in Dominica, tends to live in a bubble. If it's not happening to them, they think it's not happening at all.
That's right.
So we need to be able to monitor what's happening and be able to come back and give an assessment of ourselves.
Well, gentlemen, one of the objectives of this post-budget discussion was to disseminate information to the general public in Dominica, so that they themselves can start their more informed discussions and on the whole subject, that they would commit their time, talent, skills, and experiences to the task of building a climate resilient Dominica. So I want to just thank each and every one of you for participating tonight. I think our discussion was spirited, and I want to thank all the members of the listening public by ear and viewing via Facebook, YouTube, Kyrie, and DBS. It was a pleasure talking to you tonight, though you couldn't talk back to us, but on another occasion we'll make up to you. So thank you very much for listening and viewing, and have a pleasant night.
Thank you.